Standing alone at Gate B47 in Denver International Airport, watching my husband Marcus disappear into the crowd with his rolling suitcase, I felt something shift inside my chest. He'd just announced to our entire group that there was only one seat left on the emergency flight to Phoenix, and naturally, he'd taken it. "Claire will figure something out," he'd said with that dismissive wave of his hand that had become all too familiar. "She's resourceful." What he didn't know was that I already had figured something out, and his expression when he discovered exactly how resourceful I could be would be worth every humiliating second of this moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the terminal cast harsh shadows across my face as I stood there, luggage at my feet, watching the departure board flash updates that meant nothing to me now. Marcus had orchestrated this entire scenario with the precision of someone who'd planned it well in advance. The emergency business meeting in Phoenix that suddenly required immediate travel. The last-minute discovery that only one seat remained on the corporate jet he'd booked through his father's connections. The theatrical concern as he'd explained to his business partners why his wife would have to find alternative transportation. It was a performance designed to highlight my dependence on him, my lack of options, my position as an afterthought in his carefully constructed world. What Marcus had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, was that I wasn't just Claire Davidson, dutiful wife to the heir of Davidson Industries. I was Claire Davidson, founder and CEO of Altitude Aviation, the fastest-growing private charter company in the Rocky Mountain region. For the past 8 years, I'd built my business from a single refurbished Cessna to a fleet of luxury aircraft that served everyone from tech billionaires to A-list celebrities who valued discretion above all else. My hangar at Denver International wasn't just a storage facility, it was the headquarters of an operation that generated more revenue in a month than Marcus saw in quarterly bonuses from his family's manufacturing business. The irony of my current situation wasn't lost on me. Here I stood in an airport terminal, supposedly stranded, while less than 2 miles away sat my private hangar housing a Gulfstream G650 that could reach Phoenix in 90 minutes. Marcus knew about my business, of course. He'd even bragged about it at dinner parties when it served his purposes, introducing me as his entrepreneurial wife who'd turned her little flying hobby into something surprisingly profitable. But he'd never truly grasped the scope of what I'd built, perhaps because acknowledging it would mean admitting that his wife had succeeded on a scale that dwarfed his own achievements. The seeds of this humiliation had been planted months earlier, though I was only beginning to understand the full scope of Marcus's campaign to diminish me. It had started subtly, as these things often do. Comments about my work schedule interfering with family obligations. Suggestions that perhaps it was time to consider scaling back now that we were financially secure. Questions about whether I really needed to fly so frequently when I could hire other pilots to handle the routine flights. Each suggestion had been wrapped in apparent concern for my well-being, delivered with the kind of patronizing smile that made my skin crawl. Marcus had grown up in a world where wives were ornamental additions to successful men, beautiful accessories who organized charity events and hosted dinner parties but never outshone their husbands in matters of business or finance. His mother, Patricia Davidson, had perfected this role over 30 years of marriage to Robert Davidson, the founder of Davidson Industries. Patricia's life revolved around supporting her husband's career, raising their children to carry on the family legacy, and maintaining the social connections that kept the Davidson name prominent in Denver's business circles. When Marcus had first brought me home to meet his parents 6 years ago, I'd been charmed by their old-world elegance and impressed by their obvious devotion to each other. The Davidson family estate in Cherry Hills Village was a testament to tasteful wealth, filled with antique furniture and oil paintings that spoke of generations of careful cultivation. Patricia had welcomed me warmly, expressing genuine interest in my aviation background and asking thoughtful questions about the challenges of building a business in such a male-dominated industry. Over time, however, I'd begun to notice the subtle ways Patricia steered conversations away from my professional accomplishments and toward more traditional feminine interests. She'd compliment my outfit rather than acknowledge a recent business milestone. She'd ask about my thoughts on redecorating rather than inquire about the new routes I was establishing. When I'd mentioned plans to expand into international charters, she'd smiled politely and changed the subject to vacation destinations, as if the two topics were equivalent in her mind. Robert's treatment of me had been more direct but equally problematic. He'd developed a habit of explaining basic business concepts to me, apparently assuming that my success in aviation was somehow accidental or the result of luck rather than skill and hard work. During family dinners, he'd dominate conversations about industry trends, market conditions, and economic forecasts, nodding approvingly when Marcus contributed to the discussion but falling silent when I offered insights based on my own experience running a growing company. The most frustrating aspect of these interactions was Marcus's response, or rather, his lack of response. He never corrected his father's condescending explanations or redirected conversations to include my perspectives. He seemed content to let his family treat me as a pleasant addition to their gatherings rather than a successful businesswoman worthy of respect. When I'd mentioned this pattern to him privately, he'd assured me that his parents loved me and suggested that I might be oversensitive to perceived slights that weren't intentional. This dynamic had crystallized during our wedding planning 18 months ago. Patricia had immediately assumed control of the arrangements, presenting detailed plans for a traditional ceremony at the country club where the Davidson family had been members for 3 generations. When I'd suggested incorporating elements that reflected my own background and interests, such as a vintage aircraft flyover during the reception, Patricia had smiled indulgently and explained that such displays might be considered inappropriate for a formal wedding. Marcus had supported his mother's vision enthusiastically, describing it as elegant and timeless. He'd seemed genuinely puzzled by my desire to deviate from the classical format that had served Davidson family weddings so well in the past. When I'd pressed the issue, he'd suggested that we could plan a separate celebration later that would be more reflective of my personal style, though that secondary event had never materialized amid the demands of our new married life. The wedding itself had been undeniably beautiful, featuring 500 guests, an orchestra, and cuisine prepared by Denver's most prestigious catering company. Photographs from the event showed a radiant bride and groom surrounded by the cream of Denver society, with coverage in both the Business Journal and the lifestyle magazine that covered significant social events. Yet standing at the altar in my grandmother's redesigned wedding dress, I'd felt like an actress playing a role rather than a woman celebrating the beginning of her own marriage. Our honeymoon in Tuscany had provided a brief respite from family expectations and social obligations. For 2 weeks, Marcus and I had rediscovered the connection that had drawn us together initially. We'd explored medieval towns, sampled wines at family-owned vineyards, and spent long evenings talking about our hopes for the future. Marcus had seemed genuinely interested in my plans for expanding altitude aviation, offering suggestions and asking detailed questions about my business strategy. Unfortunately, that supportive dynamic had evaporated upon our return to Denver. Marcus had immediately thrown himself back into his work at Davidson Industries, while I'd resumed the demanding schedule required to manage a growing aviation company. The easy intimacy we'd shared in Italy had been replaced by the routine politeness of 2 busy professionals sharing a household but leading increasingly separate lives. The first major conflict had erupted 6 months after our wedding, when I'd been offered an opportunity to provide charter services for a major film production shooting in multiple locations across the western United States. The contract would have required me to be away from Denver for several weeks, but it represented exactly the kind of high-profile client relationship that could transform Altitude Aviation from a regional player into a nationally recognized brand. Marcus had been adamantly opposed to my accepting the contract, arguing that our new marriage needed more attention and stability. He'd pointed out that we'd barely seen each other since returning from our honeymoon, and suggested that perhaps this was an opportunity to reassess my priorities. When I'd explained the strategic importance of the film industry connection, he dismissed my concerns as short-sighted, insisting that a single contract couldn't possibly be worth jeopardizing our relationship. The argument had escalated over several days, with Marcus enlisting his parents' support for his position. Patricia had expressed concern about the impact of extended travel on my ability to establish roots in Denver's social community, while Robert had questioned whether the financial benefits justified the personal costs. They'd presented their opposition as concern for my well-being and our marriage, but I'd sensed an underlying discomfort with the idea of me operating too independently from family expectations and control. Ultimately, I'd compromised by restructuring the contract to minimize my time away from Denver, hiring additional pilots to handle portions of the work that would have required my personal oversight. The film production had been satisfied with the arrangement, and the project had indeed led to additional opportunities with entertainment industry clients. However, the experience had left me feeling constrained and resentful, aware that I'd limited my business growth to accommodate Marcus's insecurities and his family's traditional expectations. Similar conflicts had continued to arise over the following months, each one following a predictable pattern. I'd identify an opportunity to expand or improve my business, Marcus would express concerns about the impact on our personal life, and I'd find myself making concessions to preserve domestic harmony. The pattern was so consistent that I'd begun to anticipate his objections before even mentioning new developments, editing my plans in advance to avoid confrontations that had become increasingly draining and unproductive. The situation had reached a breaking point 3 months ago, when I'd been approached by a consortium of investors interested in partnering with Altitude Aviation to establish a network of luxury charter services throughout the Mountain West region. The proposal would have required a significant expansion of my operations, including the purchase of additional aircraft and the establishment of satellite offices in several major cities. More importantly, it represented validation of everything I'd worked to build over the past 8 years. Marcus's response had been swift and unequivocal. He'd argued that the expansion would fundamentally change our lifestyle, requiring me to travel constantly and transforming our marriage into a long-distance relationship. He'd suggested that we were already financially secure enough to enjoy a comfortable life without the additional stress and complexity that growth would bring. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most painfully, he questioned whether my ambition was becoming an obsession that was preventing me from appreciating what we'd already achieved together. The conversation had revealed a fundamental disconnect in our visions for the future. Marcus saw my business as a successful hobby that had served its purpose in establishing my independence and financial security. In his mind, the logical next step was to maintain the status quo while focusing our energy on building a family and deepening our roots in Denver's social community. He'd spoken enthusiastically about the possibility of children, describing how wonderful it would be to raise them with the stability and traditions that had shaped his own childhood. My perspective was entirely different. Altitude Aviation wasn't just a business to me, it was the tangible expression of my skills, ambition, and vision for what was possible when someone refused to accept limitations imposed by others' expectations. The investor partnership represented an opportunity to build something truly significant, to create a legacy that would extend far beyond my own lifetime. The thought of voluntarily constraining that growth felt like accepting a kind of professional death that would leave me diminished and resentful. The compromise we'd eventually reached had satisfied no one. I'd agreed to defer the expansion discussions for 6 months while we focused on strengthening our marriage and exploring options for starting a family. Marcus had promised to spend more time understanding my business and to approach future opportunities with greater openness to growth possibilities. In practice, the agreement had simply postponed our fundamental disagreement while adding new layers of tension to our daily interactions. During those 6 months of supposed marriage focus, I'd gradually become aware of subtle changes in Marcus's behavior that should have alarmed me sooner. He'd become increasingly secretive about his work schedule, claiming last-minute meetings and travel obligations that prevented him from attending industry events where my presence was expected. He'd started screening his phone calls in my presence, stepping out of rooms to take conversations that he claimed involved confidential business matters. Most concerning had been his growing criticism of my professional relationships, particularly my friendships with other successful women in aviation and business. He'd begun questioning the time I spent networking with industry contacts, suggesting that these relationships were becoming too important to me and that I was prioritizing professional advancement over our marriage. When I'd pointed out that networking was essential to maintaining and growing any business, he'd argued that I'd already achieved enough success to reduce my focus on career development. These behavioral changes had coincided with increased pressure from his family to conform to more traditional expectations for our marriage. Patricia had begun hosting regular lunches for the wives of prominent Denver businessmen, events that were positioned as social gatherings but functioned more like informal training sessions in the arts of supporting powerful husbands. The conversations at these lunches had centered on charity work, home decorating, and vacation planning, with any mention of professional accomplishments redirected toward more acceptable topics. Robert had become more direct in his suggestions that I consider transitioning my business responsibilities to hired managers, arguing that successful executives eventually learn to delegate operational duties while focusing on strategic oversight. He presented this advice as wisdom gained from decades of business experience, but I'd recognized it as a sophisticated attempt to convince me to step back from active leadership of my own company. The most insidious aspect of this family campaign had been its gradual nature and apparent good intentions. Each suggestion had been framed as concern for my well-being, advice offered by people who cared about my happiness and wanted to see our marriage thrive. The cumulative effect, however, had been to make me question my own priorities and wonder whether my commitment to professional growth was indeed incompatible with being a good wife and potential mother. This psychological pressure had been compounded by Marcus's increasingly frequent references to other couples in their social circle who seemed to have achieved better work-life balance. He'd point out wives who had successfully transitioned From demanding careers to more flexible arrangements that allowed them to support their husbands while maintaining their own interests. These women were presented as examples of mature choices, suggesting that my continued focus on business growth represented a kind of immaturity or inability to embrace adult responsibilities. The strategy had been sophisticated and nearly effective. For several weeks, I'd found myself second-guessing decisions that had once felt natural and obvious. I'd begun to wonder whether my ambition was indeed excessive, whether my desire for continued growth represented a character flaw that was preventing me from appreciating the life Marcus and I had built together. The self-doubt had been particularly insidious because it had seemed to emerge from my own reflection rather than external pressure. The wake-up call had come 6 weeks ago, during a conversation with my longtime friend and mentor, Captain Sarah Rodriguez, who had broken barriers as one of the first Latina pilots hired by a major airline and who now ran her own aviation consulting firm. Sarah had invited me to lunch, ostensibly to catch up on industry developments, but had quickly turned the conversation toward my personal situation. Sarah had noticed changes in my behavior at industry events, observing that I'd become less assertive in business discussions and more deferential to others' opinions. She'd questioned whether everything was all right with my business, expressing concern that I seemed to be losing the confidence and decisiveness that had made me so successful. When I'd attempted to explain that I was simply being more thoughtful about major decisions, Sarah had looked at me with the kind of direct assessment that only comes from someone who genuinely cares about your well-being. The conversation that followed had been uncomfortable but necessary. Sarah had shared her own experience with a previous marriage that had ended when her former husband's insecurities about her success had manifested as increasingly controlling behavior. She described the subtle ways that loving partners could undermine confidence and ambition while appearing to offer support and guidance. Most importantly, she'd helped me recognize that healthy relationships enhanced both partners' growth rather than requiring one person to diminish themselves for the other's comfort. That lunch with Sarah had sparked a period of intense self-reflection that had continued over the past month and a half. I'd begun to examine my marriage with the same analytical approach I brought to business decisions, looking for patterns and evaluating outcomes with greater objectivity. The picture that had emerged had been deeply troubling, revealing a systematic erosion of my autonomy and confidence that had been disguised as love and concern. Armed with this new awareness, I'd started paying closer attention to Marcus's behavior, and had discovered evidence that my growing suspicions were justified. The secretive phone calls and mysterious meetings weren't related to confidential business matters, as he claimed. Through careful observation and some discreet investigation, I'd learned that Marcus had been meeting regularly with Natalie Brooks, his former college girlfriend who had recently moved back to Denver after completing her MBA at Northwestern. Now, standing in this airport terminal with my abandoned luggage, I finally understood the full scope of Marcus's campaign to isolate and diminish me. This public humiliation wasn't spontaneous. It was the culminating event in a carefully orchestrated plan to demonstrate my dependence on him while positioning himself as the reasonable partner who deserved sympathy for dealing with an increasingly difficult wife. The emergency meeting in Phoenix was likely fabricated, the limited seating on the corporate jet deliberately arranged, and the entire scenario designed to show his business associates and family that I was dispensable while he was essential. What Marcus didn't realize as he smugly wheeled his luggage toward the departure gate was that I'd been gathering evidence of his deception for weeks. The mysterious phone calls, the unexplained absences, the sudden interest in working late, all of it had painted a picture that became impossible to ignore. 3 weeks ago, I'd hired a discreet private investigator, not because I wanted to destroy my marriage, but because I needed to understand what I was really dealing with. The photographs Jennifer Walsh had provided were damning enough. Marcus and Natalie sharing intimate dinners at restaurants across town, walking hand in hand through Washington Park, embracing in the parking lot of her apartment complex. But it was the financial records that had truly opened my eyes to the scope of his betrayal. Marcus had been using his access to our joint accounts to fund his relationship with Natalie, paying for weekend getaways to Aspen, expensive jewelry, and even a security deposit on a luxury condo where they could meet without risk of discovery. More disturbing were the documents Jennifer had uncovered through her connections in the legal community. Marcus had been quietly consulting with divorce attorneys for the past 4 months, exploring strategies to minimize his financial obligations, while maximizing his claim to Altitude Aviation's assets. The legal memos made it clear that his campaign to undermine my confidence hadn't been emotional manipulation, it had been calculated preparation for a divorce proceeding where he planned to argue that my business success was largely due to his family's connections and support. The pattern of his behavior suddenly made perfect sense. Every suggestion that I scale back my operations, every criticism of my professional relationships, every attempt to position my ambition as a character flaw, all of it had been designed to create a record of me as an unstable partner whose obsession with work had damaged our marriage. Marcus had been building a narrative where he would emerge as the reasonable party seeking to preserve what we'd built together, while I would be portrayed as the driven career woman who had chosen business over family. The most chilling discovery had been a series of email exchanges between Marcus and his father discussing the strategic value of gaining control over Altitude Aviation's operations. Robert Davidson had apparently identified my company as a potentially valuable acquisition for Davidson Industries, seeing an opportunity to diversify their manufacturing portfolio by expanding into transportation services. The conversations revealed that Marcus's initial interest in me might have been motivated as much by business considerations as personal attraction. These revelations had crystallized during a conversation I'd overheard last week between Marcus and his mother. I'd returned home early from a cancelled flight to find them in the kitchen, speaking in the hushed tones people use when discussing sensitive matters. Patricia had been expressing concern about the timeline for Marcus's divorce proceedings, worried that I might become suspicious if he waited much longer to file papers. She'd suggested that perhaps it was time to escalate their efforts to demonstrate my unsuitability as a wife, creating incidents that could be documented and presented as evidence of my instability. Marcus had reassured his mother that everything was proceeding according to plan. He described today's airport scenario as the perfect opportunity to show his business associates that I was unreliable and emotionally volatile, someone who couldn't be counted on during important business situations. The plan was for me to create a scene about being left behind, confirming their suspicions that I was difficult to work with and prone to dramatic overreactions. My behavior would then be used to support his narrative about why our marriage had become untenable. The conversation had continued with discussion of how they would handle the division of assets, with Patricia expressing confidence that their attorney could minimize my claims on Marcus's family wealth while ensuring that Davidson Industries gained access to my aviation contacts and expertise. They'd spoken about my business with the casual dismissiveness of people discussing a commodity to be acquired rather than the life's work of someone they claimed to care about. Standing in this terminal now, I understood that today's humiliation was intended to be my breaking point. Marcus expected me to dissolve into tears, to call him desperately begging for help, to demonstrate exactly the kind of emotional instability that would support his divorce strategy. The businessmen who had witnessed his abandonment of me would later testify about my inappropriate reaction, while he would emerge as the patient husband who had finally reached his limit with my unreasonable behavior. What Marcus had failed to consider was that building a successful aviation company required exactly the kind of strategic thinking and calm decision-making that his plan was designed to undermine. Over the past 8 years, I'd navigated equipment failures at 30,000 feet, managed client emergencies in remote locations, and solved logistical problems that would have defeated less experienced operators. The skills that had made me successful in aviation, analytical thinking, resource management, and grace under pressure, were exactly what I needed to turn this situation to my advantage. The first call I made was to Tom Martinez, my chief pilot and the person I trusted most in my organization. Tom had been with Altitude Aviation since our 3rd year of operation, when I'd hired him away from a major airline after being impressed by his professionalism and technical expertise. More than an employee, Tom had become a trusted advisor, whose judgment I valued in both business and personal matters. Tom answered on the second ring, and I could hear the ambient noise of the hangar in the background. "Claire," he said, his voice immediately shifting to concern when he heard my tone. "What's happening? Are you all right?" "I'm at DEN," I told him, keeping my voice steady despite the anger coursing through my system. "Marcus stranded me here, claiming there was only one seat on their corporate flight to Phoenix. I need you to prep the Gulfstream for immediate departure." There was a brief pause before Tom responded, and I could hear the shift in his voice as he moved from concerned friend to professional pilot. "How many passengers, and what's our destination?" "Just me," I said. "Phoenix Sky Harbor, and Tom, I want you to file our flight plan for the main terminal, not the private aviation facility. I want us to arrive exactly where Marcus's corporate jet will be landing." Tom's chuckle was audible through the phone. "I see," he said. "Should I arrange for ground transportation to be waiting, or will you be handling that personally?" "Oh, I'll be handling everything personally," I assured him. "How long do you need for pre-flight?" "Give me 40 minutes, Tom replied. "The aircraft is fueled and ready, just need to complete the inspection and file our paperwork." "Claire," he added, his voice carrying a note of professional satisfaction, "this is going to be a very smooth flight." My second call was to Linda Chen, my business manager and the person responsible for coordinating our client services. Linda had joined Altitude Aviation 2 years ago after working for a high-end concierge service that catered to ultra-wealthy clients. Her expertise in managing logistics and expectations had been invaluable as we'd expanded our operations to serve increasingly demanding customers. Linda, I said when she answered, I need you to coordinate something special for me in Phoenix. I'm flying down there this afternoon, and I want our full VIP arrival package arranged at Sky Harbor. Of course, Linda replied, and I could hear her already making notes. What level of service are we talking about? Everything, I told her. Ground transportation, catering, liaison services, the complete experience. I want this arrival to demonstrate exactly what Altitude Aviation can deliver when we're operating at full capacity. Should I coordinate with any local contacts, or are you handling the Phoenix end independently? Linda asked. Actually, I said, an idea beginning to form. Why don't you reach out to Rebecca Santos at Southwest Luxury Services? Tell her we have a client who wants to make a very memorable impression, and we'd like to showcase the kind of partnership possibilities our companies could develop together. Rebecca Santos was a woman I'd met at an industry conference 6 months earlier, someone who had built her own empire providing luxury ground services to discerning travelers throughout the Southwest. Our conversation had touched on potential collaboration opportunities, and she'd impressed me with her creativity and attention to detail. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to explore that partnership while ensuring that my arrival in Phoenix would be impossible to ignore. My third call was to David Park, the manager of our Denver hangar operations and someone whose discretion I could count on absolutely. David had been with us for 4 years, and his background in military logistics had made him invaluable in coordinating the complex movements required to maintain our fleet and support our operations. David, I said, I need you to document something for me. Marcus Davidson just abandoned me at the terminal, claiming there was no space for me on their corporate flight. I want a complete record of this incident, including timestamps and any witnesses you can identify. Already on it, David replied, and I could hear keyboard clicks in the background. I saw the whole thing from the observation deck. Pretty shameful behavior, if you ask me. I've got photos of him walking away with his luggage while you were left standing there. Perfect, I said. Also, David, I want you to coordinate with Tom on our departure procedures. Make sure everything is documented according to our standard protocols, but with extra attention to detail. This flight needs to be absolutely perfect from a regulatory and safety standpoint. Understood, David said. Claire, for what it's worth, watching you handle this situation is exactly why I'm proud to work for this company. Some people crumble under pressure, but you just get stronger. The fourth call I made was the most strategic. James Wilson was our attorney, a sharp legal mind who specialized in aviation law and business disputes. James had helped me navigate the complex regulatory requirements involved in building Altitude Aviation, and his advice had been invaluable during several challenging situations over the years. James, I said when he answered, I need to discuss a delicate situation involving my husband and some potential legal implications. James had known Marcus socially through Denver's business community, but he'd always maintained professional boundaries regarding my personal life. However, the evidence I'd gathered over the past few weeks had convinced me that those boundaries needed to be adjusted given the threats to my business interests. I'm listening, James said, his tone shifting to the careful neutrality he used when dealing with sensitive matters. I've discovered that Marcus has been consulting with divorce attorneys while simultaneously attempting to undermine my business reputation and financial stability, I explained. I have documentation of financial improprieties and evidence that he's been planning to claim ownership rights to Altitude Aviation assets. James was quiet for a moment before responding. Claire, that's a serious allegation. Do you have substantive evidence to support these claims? I do, I said. Bank records, photographs, legal memos, and recorded conversations. James, I need to understand my options for protecting my business and personal interests given what I've learned. We should schedule a meeting as soon as possible, James replied. In the meantime, I'd recommend documenting any further interactions with Marcus and avoiding any decisions that could compromise your legal position. Are you planning any immediate actions that might escalate the situation? I'm flying to Phoenix this afternoon, I told him. Marcus is expecting me to be stranded here, and I think it's important that he understands exactly what kind of resources I have at my disposal. James chuckled. That sounds like a very measured response under the circumstances. Claire, whatever you're planning, make sure it's legal, documented, and proportional. The best revenge is success, not retaliation. My final call was to someone who wouldn't be expecting to hear from me. Angela Foster was a reporter for business. Aviation Weekly, a trade publication that covered the private aviation industry with particular attention to emerging companies and industry leaders. Angela had interviewed me twice over the past year, and she'd expressed interest in doing a feature story about women entrepreneurs in aviation. Angela, I said when she answered, it's Claire Davidson from Altitude Aviation. I know this is short notice, but I have a story idea that might interest you. Claire, Angela replied, her voice immediately perking up with professional interest. What kind of story are we talking about? A story about resilience in business, I said. About how successful women handle unexpected challenges and turn them into opportunities for growth. I'm about to demonstrate exactly the kind of resource management and crisis response that makes private aviation such a valuable service for demanding clients. Angela was intrigued. Are you talking about a real-time case study, something happening right now? Exactly, I said. I'm currently at Denver International Airport, where I've just been abandoned by my husband who claimed there was no room for me on his corporate flight to Phoenix. In the next few hours, I'm going to show him exactly what kind of transportation options are available when you own your own aviation company. Angela laughed with genuine delight. Claire, that sounds like exactly the kind of story our readers would love. Are you open to having a photographer document your arrival in Phoenix? Absolutely, I said. In fact, I encourage it. I think it's important for people to understand that success creates options, and that those options become particularly valuable when people try to limit your choices. The beauty of my situation was that everything I was about to do was completely legitimate and entirely within my rights as the owner of Altitude Aviation. Marcus had made the mistake of underestimating my resources and my determination, assuming that his abandonment would leave me helpless and dependent on his assistance. Instead, he'd created the perfect opportunity for me to demonstrate exactly why his dismissive attitude toward my business had been such a fundamental error in judgment. As I walked toward the exit of the terminal, I felt a calm sense of purpose settling over me. The humiliation of being left behind was transforming into anticipation for what was about to unfold. Marcus had set the stage for his own downfall, and I was going to ensure that his performance was absolutely unforgettable. The drive to my hangar took exactly 12 minutes, during which I used the time to refine the details of my plan. Tom would have the Gulfstream ready for departure within the hour, giving us a comfortable arrival time that would coincide perfectly with the landing of Marcus's corporate flight. Rebecca Santos would coordinate ground services that would create exactly the kind of visible demonstration I wanted to achieve. And Angela Foster would be there to document the entire sequence of events for an industry publication that Marcus's business contacts undoubtedly read. By the time I pulled into the parking area adjacent to our hangar, I could see Tom conducting his pre-flight inspection with his characteristic thoroughness. The sight of our pristine Gulfstream G650 gleaming in the afternoon sunlight filled me with pride and determination. This aircraft represented everything I'd worked to build over the past 8 years, a tangible symbol of success that no one could diminish or take away from me. Tom looked up as I approached, offering a professional nod that couldn't quite hide his obvious satisfaction with the situation. Pre-flight complete, he said. We're cleared for departure whenever you're ready. Claire, he added, his voice carrying a note of personal conviction, this is going to be one hell of a flight. Yes, I replied, climbing the steps into the luxurious cabin that I'd personally designed to exceed the expectations of our most demanding clients. Yes, it certainly is. The Gulfstream's engine spooled up with the distinctive whine that never failed to remind me why I'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. From my seat in the aircraft's elegantly appointed cabin, I watched Denver's skyline recede through the oval window as Tom executed a flawless departure that showcased exactly why Altitude Aviation had earned its reputation for operational excellence. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. While Marcus was cramped into whatever budget corporate aircraft his father's company had managed to secure, I was traveling in luxury aboard an aircraft worth more than most people's homes. During the 90-minute flight to Phoenix, I used the time to coordinate the final details of what was rapidly becoming a masterclass in resource deployment. The satellite communication system allowed me to maintain constant contact with my team while reviewing the intelligence Jennifer Walsh had provided about Marcus's activities. The private investigator had been even more thorough than I'd initially realized, documenting not just his affair with Natalie Brooks but also his systematic attempts to gather confidential information about Altitude Aviation's operations and client relationships. The evidence suggested that Marcus had been photographing documents from my home office, copying client contact information, and even recording conversations during business dinners where I discussed strategic plans with industry partners. This intelligence gathering had apparently been coordinated with his father's legal team, creating a comprehensive database of information that could be used to support their eventual takeover attempt. The violation of trust was staggering, but the strategic implications were even more concerning. Rebecca Santos called while we were cruising at 41,000 feet, her voice crackling slightly through the satellite connection as she confirmed the arrangements for my arrival at Phoenix Sky Harbor. Rebecca's company had outdone themselves, coordinating a reception that would demonstrate exactly the kind of seamless luxury service that distinguished truly successful aviation operations from budget alternatives. "Claire," Rebecca said, her excitement evident even through the digital compression of the satellite link, "this is going to be spectacular. We've arranged for a motorcade of 3 vehicles, a Bentley Mulsanne for your personal transportation, plus support vehicles for luggage and security. The drivers are all former executive protection specialists, and we've coordinated with Sky Harbor operations to ensure priority handling through all security checkpoints." "Perfect," I replied, reviewing the timeline she'd sent to my tablet. "What about the media coordination?" "Angela Foster from Business Aviation Weekly will be positioned at the private aviation terminal with a professional photographer," Rebecca confirmed. "We've also arranged for discrete documentation of the entire arrival sequence, so you'll have a complete record of today's events." "Claire, I have to say, this is exactly the kind of partnership opportunity one was hoping we could develop between our companies." The collaboration with Rebecca was proving to be mutually beneficial in ways that extended far beyond today's specific requirements. Her company's reputation for discretion and excellence made them perfect partners for Altitude Aviation's expansion into southwestern markets, while our aircraft and operational capabilities could provide her clients with transportation options that exceeded anything currently available through commercial or competing charter services. Tom's voice came through the cabin intercom as we began our descent into Phoenix airspace. "Claire, we're about 15 minutes out from Sky Harbor. Ground control has cleared us for priority approach to the private aviation facility, and I can see another corporate aircraft on final approach that matches the description you provided for your husband's flight." "Excellent timing," I replied, feeling a surge of satisfaction as the various elements of my plan converged exactly as I'd orchestrated. "Tom, please coordinate with ground operations to ensure we're positioned where the arrival will be clearly visible from the main terminal's observation areas." The descent into Phoenix provided a perfect opportunity to review the financial documentation that would form the foundation of my legal strategy going forward. James Wilson had been correct about the importance of maintaining detailed records, and the evidence I'd gathered painted a damning picture of systematic deception and potential fraud. Marcus's use of joint account funds to support his affair could be characterized as financial infidelity, while his attempts to gather proprietary business information clearly violated both my trust and potentially several federal regulations regarding the unauthorized access to sensitive commercial data. More significantly, the email exchanges between Marcus and his father revealed a conspiracy to defraud me of my legitimate business interests through manipulation and deliberate misrepresentation. Their plan to portray my professional success as somehow dependent on Davidson family connections was not only insulting but legally actionable, especially given the documentary evidence I possessed regarding my company's independent development and success. The Gulfstream touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor with the gentle precision that exemplified Tom's exceptional skill as a pilot. As we taxied toward the private aviation terminal, I could see the motorcade Rebecca had arranged waiting in perfect formation, their polished surfaces gleaming in the Arizona sunshine. The contrast with Marcus's expected arrival experience was going to be dramatic and impossible to ignore. Angela Foster was positioned exactly where Rebecca had promised, her photographer already documenting our arrival with the kind of professional attention to detail that would ensure comprehensive coverage of today's events. The business aviation industry was relatively small and tightly connected, meaning that news of this demonstration would circulate quickly through exactly the networks where Marcus hoped to establish his credibility as a serious business operator. Tom completed the shutdown procedures with his characteristic thoroughness before opening the cabin door and lowering the aircraft's integral stairs. The Arizona heat hit us immediately, but the ground crew Rebecca had coordinated was already moving with the kind of synchronized precision that marked truly professional operations. My luggage was transferred to the support vehicle while the Bentley's driver held the rear door open with the bearing of someone accustomed to serving clients who expected excellence as a baseline rather than an exception. The drive from the private aviation terminal to Sky Harbor's main commercial terminal took exactly 8 minutes, during which I reviewed the final intelligence updates Jennifer Walsh had provided regarding Marcus's expected arrival time and gate assignment. His flight was scheduled to land at gate A012, which meant his deplaning passengers would have to walk through the main concourse before reaching ground transportation. The timing was perfect for what I had in mind. Rebecca had coordinated with Sky Harbor operations to ensure that our motorcade would be positioned prominently in the pickup area directly adjacent to where Marcus's group would emerge from the terminal. The visual impact would be unmistakable. While he and his business associates struggled with their luggage and waited for whatever budget ground transportation Davidson Industries had arranged, I would be stepping into a luxury vehicle that clearly demonstrated the difference between authentic success and inherited mediocrity. The psychological impact of this contrast was exactly what I wanted to achieve. Marcus had spent months systematically undermining my confidence and professional reputation, positioning himself as the practical partner while characterizing my ambitions as unrealistic and potentially destructive to our relationship. Today's events would demonstrate definitively that his assessment of our relative capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. Angela Foster was waiting in the pickup area when our motorcade arrived, her photographer capturing the seamless coordination as I stepped from the Bentley while my luggage was transferred to the lead vehicle. The professional documentation would provide irrefutable evidence of the kind of resources I commanded independently of any support from Marcus or his family's connections. Claire, Angela said, approaching with the confident professionalism that had made her such a respected voice in aviation journalism, this arrival sequence is exactly the kind of success story our readers want to hear. The coordination between your aircraft operations and ground services demonstrates why private aviation continues to grow as an option for business travelers who value efficiency and reliability. The story writes itself, I replied, watching through the terminal's glass walls as passengers began deplaning from what I could now confirm was Marcus's flight. In about 10 minutes, you're going to witness a very instructive comparison between different approaches to business travel and resource management. Marcus emerged from the terminal exactly when the flight tracking information had predicted, wheeling his carry-on luggage while engaged in animated conversation with two men I recognized as senior executives from companies his father hoped to develop partnerships with. The sight of him laughing and gesturing confidently, apparently enjoying the camaraderie that came from abandoning his wife at an airport, triggered a surge of cold anger that I channeled into focus and determination. His expression changed dramatically when he noticed our motorcade positioned prominently in the pickup area. I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of stunned disbelief as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. The men he'd been talking with followed his gaze, their own expressions shifting as they took in the obvious luxury and professional coordination of my arrival setup. I stepped out of the Bentley at precisely the moment Marcus and his companions reached the pickup area, timing the movement to maximize the visual impact of the contrast between our respective situations. While they stood there with their wheeled luggage looking around for their ground transportation, I was being assisted by a professionally dressed driver while a security specialist coordinated the movement of my belongings with military precision. Marcus, I called out, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by his business companions without seeming to shout. I hope your flight was comfortable. Mine was absolutely perfect. The silence that followed was electric with tension and embarrassment. Marcus's face had gone pale beneath his tan, while his companions looked back and forth between us with expressions that suggested they were rapidly reassessing their understanding of our relationship dynamics. These were men accustomed to evaluating business situations quickly, and the evidence before them painted a picture that contradicted everything Marcus had told them about my supposed dependence on his family's resources. Angela Foster moved closer with her photographer, documenting the interaction with the professional discretion that made her such a valuable media contact. The coverage would focus on the business aspects of the story rather than personal drama, but the implications would be clear to anyone familiar with corporate relationship dynamics. How did you get here? Marcus asked, his voice strained with confusion and mounting panic. You were stranded at the airport. There weren't any available flights. I wasn't stranded, I replied calmly, gesturing toward the Gulfstream G650 that was still visible on the tarmac beyond the terminal windows. I own my own aircraft, Marcus. I've owned it for 3 years. The fact that you've never paid attention to the details of my business operations doesn't mean those resources don't exist. One of Marcus's companions, a tall man with silver hair, whom I recognized as the CEO of a major construction company, stepped forward with obvious interest. Ms. Davidson, he said, extending his hand, I'm Richard Webb from Webb Construction. I have to say, that's an impressive aircraft. The G650 is considered the gold standard for transcontinental business travel. Thank you, Mr. Webb, I replied, accepting his handshake with professional warmth. Altitude Aviation has been operating Gulfstream aircraft for several years now. We find that our clients appreciate the combination of speed, range, and cabin comfort, especially for time-sensitive business travel. Marcus's second companion, a younger man with the bearing of someone accustomed to high-level corporate negotiations, introduced himself as Daniel Torres from Torres Development Group. Ms. Davidson, he said, his tone carrying genuine admiration, we've actually heard about your company through industry contacts. Your reputation for reliability and discretion is very impressive. The conversation continued for several more minutes, during which both men asked detailed questions about Altitude Aviation Services while Marcus stood silent, his face growing increasingly flushed as he realized how completely his narrative about my supposed limitations was being demolished. These were exactly the kind of business leaders he'd hoped to impress with his casual dismissal of his wife's capabilities, and instead they were treating me with the professional respect that successful entrepreneurs routinely accorded to their peers. Rebecca Santos appeared at my elbow with perfect timing, approaching with the kind of understated professionalism that marked truly sophisticated service providers. Ms. Davidson, she said quietly, your ground transportation is ready whenever you'd like to depart. We've confirmed your dinner reservations and coordinated with your hotel regarding the early check-in you requested. Excellent, I replied, then turned back to Webb and Torres with a businesslike smile. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure meeting you. If your companies ever have requirements for reliable charter services in the Rocky Mountain region, I hope you'll consider Altitude Aviation. We pride ourselves on delivering exactly the kind of seamless travel experience that busy executives need to maximize their productivity. Both men accepted my business cards with obvious interest, and Webb mentioned that his company frequently coordinated executive travel between Denver and Phoenix for major construction projects. The networking opportunity that Marcus's abandonment had inadvertently created was turning into exactly the kind of high-value business development that had driven Altitude Aviation's growth from the beginning. As our motorcade prepared to depart, I turned back to Marcus one final time. Marcus, I said, my voice carrying just enough concern to sound supportive while making it clear that I was completely in control of the situation, I hope you can find adequate transportation to wherever you're staying. If you need any recommendations for reliable ground services, I'm sure Rebecca's company could assist you. The look on Marcus's face as our motorcade pulled away was everything I'd hoped to achieve. The confident smugness he displayed while abandoning me at Denver International had been replaced by shocked humiliation and dawning recognition of how completely he'd underestimated both my resources and my determination. His business companions were clearly reassessing their understanding of our relationship dynamics, while Angela Foster's photographer captured the entire sequence for documentation that would circulate throughout the business aviation community. During the drive to the Phoenician resort, where Rebecca had arranged accommodations that would provide a suitable base for the rest of my Phoenix visit, I reviewed the day's events with deep satisfaction. Marcus had orchestrated his own humiliation by creating a situation that allowed me to demonstrate exactly the kind of capabilities he'd spent months trying to convince everyone I didn't possess. The strategic value of today's demonstration extended far beyond personal vindication. Webb and Torres represented exactly the kind of corporate clients that Altitude Aviation needed to continue its expansion into southwestern markets, and their obvious interest in our services suggested that Marcus's attempt to damage my professional reputation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of portraying me as dependent and unreliable, he'd inadvertently created a platform for showcasing the sophisticated resources and operational excellence that distinguished my company from budget alternatives. Rebecca's coordination had been flawless, demonstrating why partnerships with established luxury service providers were so valuable for companies like mine that operated in markets where excellence was expected rather than exceptional. The seamless integration between aircraft operations, ground transportation, and hospitality services had created exactly the kind of comprehensive travel experience that sophisticated clients valued and were willing to pay premium prices to secure. Most importantly, today's events had established a clear record of Marcus's deceptive behavior while positioning me as the professional partner who maintained dignity and competence under pressure. The contrast between his abandonment tactics and my measured response would provide excellent support for the legal strategy James Wilson and I were developing to protect my business interests during what were clearly going to be contentious divorce proceedings. As our motorcade pulled into the Phoenician Circular Drive, where uniformed staff waited to provide the kind of personalized service that marked truly exceptional hospitality operations, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how completely the tables had turned. Marcus had intended today to be the beginning of my downfall, the first public demonstration of my supposed dependence on his family's support and connections. Instead, it had become a masterclass in the kind of resource deployment and strategic thinking that had made me successful in the first place. The evening ahead would provide additional opportunities to consolidate the business relationships that had emerged from today's unexpected networking opportunity, while the documentation Angela Foster was preparing would ensure that the business aviation community understood exactly what had transpired. Marcus's reputation as a serious business operator was about to suffer significantly, while mine had been enhanced through demonstration rather than mere assertion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the full implications of today's events rippled through both personal and professional networks, but tonight I intended to enjoy the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly and objectives achieved completely. Marcus had taught me an important lesson about the dangers of underestimating people, and I was confident he would never make that particular mistake again. The aftermath began unfolding before I'd even finished my dinner at the Phoenician's signature restaurant. My phone started buzzing with messages around 8:30, beginning with a series of increasingly frantic texts from Marcus that painted a clear picture of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The first message was terse and angry, demanding an explanation for what he called my theatrical performance at the airport. By the fourth message, his tone had shifted to desperate pleading, begging me to call him so we could discuss what he termed a misunderstanding that was getting out of hand. The most telling communication came not from Marcus but from his father, Robert Davidson. The elder Davidson's message was brief but revealed volumes about how quickly news of today's events had circulated through Denver's business community. "Claire," Robert's text read, "we need to discuss the situation in Phoenix immediately. There are serious business implications that require prompt attention and damage control. Please call me at your earliest convenience." The speed with which Robert had learned about the airport confrontation suggested that either Webb or Torres had already reached out to contacts in Denver, sharing the story of the abandoned wife who had turned the tables so spectacularly on her dismissive husband. Given the interconnected nature of business relationships in cities like Denver and Phoenix, such rapid communication wasn't surprising, but it indicated that Marcus's humiliation was already becoming a topic of conversation in exactly the circles where he'd hoped to establish his credibility. Angela Foster's preliminary article appeared online at Business Aviation Weekly's website just after 9 o'clock, accompanied by professionally shot photographs that captured the stark contrast between Marcus's disheveled emergence from the commercial terminal and my orchestrated arrival via luxury motorcade. The piece was carefully written to focus on business themes rather than personal drama, but the implications were unmistakable to anyone familiar with corporate dynamics and relationship politics. The article's headline read, "Aviation Entrepreneur Demonstrates Resource Flexibility During Business Travel Challenge," and Angela had crafted the content to showcase exactly the kind of operational excellence and strategic thinking that distinguished successful companies from mediocre ones. Her description of Altitude Aviation's capabilities, combined with quotes from Webb and Torres praising my professionalism, created a narrative that positioned me as exactly the kind of innovative business leader that serious executives valued as partners and allies. More importantly, Angela had included enough detail about the circumstances to make clear that Marcus's abandonment had been deliberate rather than accidental, while my response had demonstrated both the personal dignity and professional competence that marked truly successful entrepreneurs. The piece concluded with a discussion of how private aviation resources were increasingly becoming essential tools for business leaders who needed to maintain operational flexibility in rapidly changing market conditions. The real impact of the article became apparent when my phone started ringing with calls from industry contacts and potential clients who had read the piece online. Catherine Rodriguez from Rodriguez Entertainment called to congratulate me on what she described as a masterful demonstration of crisis management, while simultaneously inquiring about Altitude Aviation's availability for an upcoming film production that would require extensive travel coordination throughout the Southwest. David Chen from Chen Technologies reached out to discuss potential partnership opportunities, explaining that his company's expansion into renewable energy projects would require exactly the kind of reliable charter services that my article had showcased. The conversation revealed that David had actually been considering several aviation companies for his transportation needs, but today's demonstration had convinced him that Altitude Aviation possessed the operational sophistication and strategic thinking his projects would demand. Most significantly, Richard Webb called personally to follow up on our brief airport conversation, expressing genuine interest in establishing a formal partnership between Webb Construction and Altitude Aviation for executive transportation needs related to their major infrastructure projects. Webb's company specialized in large-scale construction throughout the Mountain West region, and their transportation requirements represented exactly the kind of consistent, high-value business that could anchor Altitude Aviation's expansion into new markets. During our 30-minute conversation, Webb shared his perspective on what he'd witnessed at Phoenix Sky Harbor, describing it as one of the most impressive displays of business composure and resource management he'd encountered in recent memory. He'd been particularly struck by the seamless coordination between aircraft operations, ground services, and media relations, seeing it as evidence of the kind of comprehensive thinking that marked truly exceptional business operators. Webb also mentioned, almost casually, that he'd shared the story with several colleagues in Denver's business community, describing it as an example of how successful entrepreneurs handled unexpected challenges. The implication was clear: Marcus's reputation as a serious business operator was being undermined throughout exactly the networks where he'd hoped to establish credibility, while mine was being enhanced through word-of-mouth endorsements from respected industry leaders. The evening's most satisfying call came from Jennifer Walsh, my private investigator, who had been monitoring Marcus's activities throughout the day and had remarkable intelligence to share about the Davidson family's response to the airport incident. According to Jennifer's sources, Marcus had called an emergency family meeting for later that evening, while Robert Davidson had been frantically reaching out to business contacts trying to assess the damage to the family's reputation. Jennifer had also learned that Natalie Brooks had been present during Marcus's arrival at his Phoenix hotel, creating additional complications as he tried to manage the fallout from the airport confrontation while simultaneously maintaining his relationship with his pregnant mistress. The stress of juggling multiple deceptions was apparently taking its toll, and Jennifer's contacts had observed Marcus displaying the kind of erratic behavior that suggested he was losing control of the situation entirely. Most concerning for the Davidson family was the discovery that several of their business partners had already heard about the airport incident and were quietly reassessing their relationships with Davidson Industries. The family's carefully cultivated image of traditional stability and conservative business practices was being undermined by Marcus's obvious personal failures and questionable judgment in abandoning his successful wife in such a public manner. Around 10:30, I received a call that I'd been expecting since leaving the airport. Tom Martinez phoned from Denver to report that the Gulfstream's return flight had been smooth and that all post-flight procedures had been completed according to our standard protocols. More importantly, Tom had news about developments at our Denver hangar that painted a clear picture of how today's events were reverberating throughout the local aviation community. Tom reported that several competing charter companies had called during the evening, ostensibly to inquire about operational matters but actually fishing for information about Altitude Aviation's client relationships and business prospects. The competitive intelligence gathering suggested that our industry rivals were trying to assess whether today's publicity represented an opportunity to poach clients or partnerships, or whether it had actually strengthened our market position. More significantly, Tom had fielded calls from 3 major corporations that were current or former clients of Davidson Industries, all expressing interest in learning more about Altitude Aviation services for their executive transportation needs. The timing of these inquiries wasn't coincidental. News of Marcus's behavior had clearly reached their executive teams, prompting them to reconsider their business relationships with companies that demonstrated such poor judgment in personal matters. The most telling development was a call Tom had received from Patricia Davidson herself, inquiring about whether I was planning to return to Denver that evening and whether there might be an opportunity for what she termed a family discussion to clear up any misunderstandings about the day's events. The fact that Marcus's mother was reaching out directly to my employees suggested that the Davidson family recognized they were facing a genuine crisis that required immediate damage control. Tom had handled Patricia's inquiry with perfect professionalism, explaining that my travel schedule was confidential and that all communications regarding business matters should be directed through appropriate channels. His response had maintained proper boundaries while making clear that Altitude Aviation operated according to professional standards that the Davidson family apparently didn't understand or respect. Around 11 o'clock, I finally returned Marcus's calls, placing the conversation on speaker while taking notes that would be useful for the legal strategy James Wilson and I were developing. Marcus answered on the first ring, his voice tight with stress and barely controlled anger as he immediately launched into accusations about my supposedly vindictive behavior and deliberate attempts to embarrass him in front of important business contacts. "Claire," Marcus said, his voice strained with emotion, "what you did today was completely out of line. You made me look incompetent in front of people whose respect I need for important business deals. This whole theatrical performance with the private jet and the motorcade was designed to humiliate me, and I want to know what you think you're going to accomplish with these games." The conversation that followed was illuminating in ways that Marcus clearly didn't intend. His primary concern wasn't about our marriage or the trust he'd violated through his affair and financial deceptions, but about the professional damage that today's events had caused to his reputation and business prospects. He spoke about feeling betrayed by my failure to maintain what he called appropriate loyalty to family interests, apparently oblivious to the irony of such complaints given his own behavior over the past several months. Marcus also revealed significant Information about his family's financial situation that confirmed much of what Jennifer Walsh had uncovered through her investigation. The Davidson Industries was apparently facing more serious challenges than I'd realized, with several major clients reconsidering their relationships and at least 2 significant contracts being placed under review pending resolution of what Marcus termed personal matters affecting the company's stability. Most tellingly, Marcus admitted that his father was furious about today's events and had demanded a complete explanation of how a simple business trip had turned into what Robert Davidson was calling a public relations disaster. The elder Davidson had apparently spent the evening fielding calls from business associates who wanted to understand the implications of the airport incident for their ongoing relationships with Davidson Industries. Marcus's desperation became increasingly apparent as the conversation continued, particularly when he began offering concessions that revealed how completely his position had deteriorated. He suggested that perhaps we could work together to issue some kind of joint statement explaining that today's events had been a misunderstanding, proposing that I could help repair the damage to his reputation in exchange for what he termed greater consideration of my business interests in future family decisions. The offer was both pathetic and revealing, demonstrating that Marcus still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of our situation. He continued to frame the conflict in terms of family dynamics and personal relationships, apparently unable to grasp that his systematic deception and attempted fraud had transformed our marriage into a business dispute where legal rather than emotional considerations would determine the outcome. When I declined his suggestion for joint damage control, Marcus's tone shifted to threats that revealed both his desperation and his continuing failure to understand my legal position. He warned that divorce proceedings could become very expensive and complicated, suggesting that my business interests might suffer if I continued what he called my campaign of public embarrassment against his family. The threats were counterproductive in multiple ways, providing additional evidence of his unstable judgment while demonstrating exactly the kind of intimidation tactics that James Wilson had warned me to document carefully. Marcus was essentially creating evidence of his own vindictive intentions while apparently believing that such pressure would convince me to abandon the legal protections I'd already put in place. I ended the call by informing Marcus that all future communications should be directed through my attorney, explaining that the situation had moved beyond personal matters into legal territory where professional representation was appropriate. His shocked silence at this declaration suggested that he genuinely believed our conflict could be resolved through family pressure and emotional manipulation rather than legal processes designed to protect business interests and personal assets. The final development of the evening came in the form of an encrypted email from James Wilson, who had apparently been working late to review the evidence I'd provided about Marcus's financial improprieties and business interference. James's preliminary legal analysis was even more favorable than I'd hoped, suggesting that the documentation I'd gathered would provide excellent protection against any attempts to claim ownership rights to Altitude Aviation's assets or operations. More importantly, James had identified several potential criminal violations in Marcus's unauthorized access to my business records and his systematic gathering of confidential client information. The federal regulations governing the protection of sensitive commercial data were quite specific about unauthorized access and disclosure, and Marcus's activities appeared to violate multiple provisions that could result in serious legal consequences, extending far beyond divorce proceedings. James's message concluded with strategic advice about managing the situation going forward, emphasizing the importance of maintaining detailed documentation while avoiding any actions that could be characterized as retaliatory or vindictive. The legal strategy would focus on protecting my legitimate business interests while ensuring that Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his deceptive and potentially criminal behavior. As I prepared for bed in the Phoenician's luxurious accommodations, I reflected on how completely the day's events had exceeded my expectations for demonstrating the futility of Marcus's campaign against me. His attempt to publicly humiliate me had backfired spectacularly, creating business opportunities while undermining his own reputation and revealing the weakness of his position to anyone paying attention. The intelligence Jennifer Walsh had gathered suggested that the Davidson family was scrambling to contain damage that extended far beyond personal embarrassment into genuine threats to their business operations and financial stability. Meanwhile, the networking opportunities that had emerged from today's airport confrontation were already generating the kind of high-value business relationships that would accelerate Altitude Aviation's expansion into new markets. Most satisfying was the recognition that I'd handled the entire situation using exactly the same strategic thinking and operational excellence that had made me successful in aviation from the beginning. Marcus had underestimated my resources and capabilities so completely that his attack had become the catalyst for demonstrating why his dismissive attitude had been such a fundamental error in judgment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the full implications of today's events continued to ripple through both personal and professional networks, but tonight I could enjoy the satisfaction of watching Marcus's carefully constructed deceptions collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. He'd taught me valuable lessons about the importance of protecting myself against people who would exploit trust for personal gain, and I was confident those lessons would serve me well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The transformation was complete 6 months later when I stood in the boardroom of Altitude Aviation's new headquarters in downtown Denver, looking out at a skyline that had once seemed dominated by the Davidson Industries building but now felt like territory I owned through achievement rather than association. The morning's Wall Street Journal lay open on my desk, featuring a prominent article about Altitude Aviation's acquisition of 2 competing charter companies and our expansion into international markets, complete with a photograph of me standing beside our newest Bombardier Global 7500 at Denver International Airport. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very airport where Marcus had attempted to demonstrate my supposed helplessness had become the launching point for a business transformation that exceeded even my most ambitious projections. The humiliation he'd orchestrated had become the catalyst for exactly the kind of strategic growth that his interference had been designed to prevent, proving that his fundamental misunderstanding of my capabilities extended far beyond personal relationships into basic business judgment. The 6 months following the Phoenix airport incident had unfolded like a masterclass in how authentic success attracts opportunity while manufactured privilege crumbles under scrutiny. Within 2 weeks of returning from Phoenix, I'd signed partnership agreements with both Webb Construction and Torres Development Group, contracts that anchored Altitude Aviation's expansion into the Southwest market while providing the financial foundation for our acquisition strategy. Richard Webb had proven to be exactly the kind of strategic partner that growing companies need, bringing not just consistent business but introductions to an entire network of construction and development firms that required sophisticated transportation solutions. His public endorsement of Altitude Aviation's capabilities had carried weight throughout the industry, opening doors that might have taken years to approach through traditional marketing channels. Daniel Torres had been equally valuable, but in different ways that highlighted the networking benefits of maintaining dignity under pressure. His development company's requirements for investor transportation and client services had led to a consulting contract that positioned Altitude Aviation as the preferred aviation partner for several major real estate projects throughout the Mountain West region. The business relationships that emerged from Marcus's intended humiliation had generated more than $12 million in new revenue during the first quarter alone, transforming Altitude Aviation from a regional player into a company that competed nationally for high-value contracts. The growth had been so rapid that I'd needed to hire additional pilots, expand our maintenance capabilities, and establish satellite operations in 3 new cities. Most satisfying had been the acquisition of Rocky Mountain Charter, the company that had been providing transportation services to Davidson Industries for the past decade. The irony of purchasing Marcus's father's preferred aviation vendor had been too perfect to resist, especially since the acquisition gave me access to client relationships and operational insights that would prove valuable for future business development. The Davidson family's decline had been equally dramatic but in the opposite direction. Within a month of the Phoenix incident, 3 major clients had terminated their contracts with Davidson Industries, citing concerns about management stability and decision-making competence. The family's carefully cultivated image of conservative reliability had been shattered by Marcus's public display of poor judgment and questionable character. Robert Davidson's attempts at damage control had only accelerated the company's problems, particularly when his heavy-handed efforts to pressure former business partners into maintaining their relationships had backfired spectacularly. The business community had responded to his intimidation tactics with exactly the kind of coordinated resistance that established players use to discipline members who violate acceptable behavioral standards. The financial investigation that federal authorities had launched into Davidson Industries' accounting practices had revealed irregularities that extended far beyond Marcus's misuse of joint account funds. The systematic manipulation of contracts and vendor relationships had apparently been standard practice for years, creating liability exposure that threatened the company's survival and personal legal jeopardy for multiple family members. Marcus himself had become a cautionary tale that circulated throughout Denver's business community, his name associated with exactly the kind of professional incompetence and personal instability that serious executives avoided in potential partners. The affair with Natalie Brooks had become public knowledge when she'd filed a paternity suit demanding child support payments that Marcus couldn't afford given his deteriorating financial position. The divorce proceedings had concluded 3 months ago with terms that exceeded even James Wilson's optimistic projections. Marcus's attempts to claim ownership rights to Altitude Aviation assets had been dismissed completely when the evidence of his unauthorized access to confidential business information had been presented to the court. His systematic gathering of proprietary data had been characterized as industrial espionage, creating criminal liability that had motivated him to accept settlement terms that protected my business interests completely. More importantly, the financial fraud investigation had frozen most of the Davidson family's assets, preventing Marcus from accessing funds that might have prolonged the litigation. His legal position had deteriorated so rapidly that his attorney had recommended accepting whatever terms I was willing to offer rather than risking additional exposure through extended proceedings. The final divorce decree had awarded me complete ownership of Altitude Aviation plus additional monetary settlements. That reflected both the financial damage Marcus had attempted to cause and the criminal nature of his information-gathering activities. The court had been particularly concerned about the violation of trust involved in his systematic photography of confidential documents and recording of private business conversations. Marcus's current situation was a study in how quickly privilege could evaporate when it wasn't supported by actual competence or character. He was living in a modest apartment in Aurora, working as a sales representative for an industrial equipment company, and struggling to meet the child support obligations that Natalie's attorneys had secured through aggressive litigation. The contrast with my own circumstances couldn't have been more dramatic. The new Altitude Aviation headquarters occupied 3 floors of a prestigious downtown office building, with executive offices that overlooked the mountains and operations centers that coordinated flights throughout North America and increasingly into international markets. The company's fleet had grown to include 12 aircraft ranging from efficient light jets for regional transportation to ultra-long-range aircraft capable of non-stop flights to Europe and Asia. Our pilot roster included former military aviators and airline captains who brought exactly the kind of operational expertise that demanding clients expected from premium service providers. The media attention surrounding Altitude Aviation's growth had been uniformly positive, focusing on themes of entrepreneurial success and innovative business development rather than the personal drama that had catalyzed our expansion. Angela Foster's original article had been followed by feature stories in several major business publications, each one reinforcing the narrative of a visionary leader who had built something significant through skill and determination. The speaking engagements that resulted from this coverage had become another revenue source while establishing me as a thought leader in the aviation industry. Corporate conferences and professional associations regularly invited me to discuss topics ranging from business strategy to crisis management, opportunities that enhanced both personal reputation and company visibility. The keynote address I delivered at the International Aviation Summit in Las Vegas had been particularly well received, focusing on how successful companies turned unexpected challenges into growth opportunities. The presentation had used the airport incident as a case study in strategic thinking and resource deployment, though I'd been careful to frame the discussion in terms of business principles rather than personal conflicts. The audience's response had been enthusiastic, with several attendees approaching afterward to discuss partnership opportunities and collaborative ventures. The networking value of these speaking engagements had proven to be enormous, creating relationships with industry leaders throughout North America and Europe. Most rewarding had been the recognition from professional organizations that validated not just business success but leadership excellence. The Women in Aviation International had honored me with their Entrepreneur of the Year award, while the National Business Aviation Association had included Altitude Aviation in their annual showcase of innovative companies that were reshaping the industry. These honors carried weight beyond personal satisfaction, providing third-party validation that enhanced credibility with potential clients and partners. The awards were displayed prominently in our headquarters lobby, sending a clear message about the company's commitment to excellence and industry leadership. The personal transformation had been equally significant, though more subtle in its manifestations. The confidence that Marcus had systematically tried to undermine had returned stronger than before, reinforced by daily evidence of my capabilities and accomplishments. The self-doubt that his manipulation had created had evaporated entirely, replaced by the kind of unshakable self-assurance that came from proven success under pressure. The social dynamics in Denver had shifted dramatically as well. The country club circles that had once treated me as Marcus's accessory now approached me with the respectful interest reserved for successful business leaders. Invitations to charity boards and civic organizations reflected recognition of my community standing rather than marriage-based social connections. Patricia Davidson's attempts to maintain social relationships had been politely but firmly rebuffed, making clear that the bridges her son had burned couldn't be rebuilt through maternal diplomacy. The older woman's obvious distress at her family's social exile had been somewhat satisfying, though I'd been careful to maintain dignity rather than appearing vindictive. The romantic relationships that had emerged over the past few months had been refreshingly different from my experience with Marcus. Professional men who understood and respected ambition had replaced the insecurity and competition that had characterized my marriage. The conversations centered on mutual goals and shared interests rather than demands for diminished aspirations and compromised independence. Dr. Michael Sinclair, the emergency medicine physician I'd been seeing for the past 2 months, represented exactly the kind of partner who enhanced rather than constrained personal growth. His demanding career in trauma surgery meant he understood the requirements of professional excellence while appreciating the satisfaction that came from doing important work at the highest levels. Our relationship had developed naturally through shared interests in aviation and outdoor activities, with none of the calculated courtship and family approval processes that had characterized my involvement with Marcus. Michael's success was entirely self-generated, based on skills and dedication rather than inherited advantage, creating compatibility that extended far beyond superficial attraction. The conversation about moving in together had emerged organically as our relationship deepened, based on practical considerations about time management and emotional compatibility rather than social expectations or financial convenience. The prospect of building something together felt natural and exciting in ways that my marriage to Marcus never had, even during its early stages. The morning's scheduled activities reflected how completely my priorities had evolved since the divorce. The quarterly board meeting would review expansion plans that included operations in London and Tokyo, markets that represented the kind of international growth I'd always envisioned for altitude aviation. The investor presentations that afternoon would showcase opportunities for strategic partnerships with European aviation companies, relationships that could accelerate our entrance into markets where American companies faced regulatory and cultural challenges. The acquisition negotiations that James Wilson had been coordinating were approaching conclusion, with 2 additional charter companies expressing serious interest in joining the altitude aviation network. The consolidation strategy was creating economies of scale while expanding our geographic reach and service capabilities in ways that enhanced competitiveness against larger rivals. The technology initiatives that our IT team had been developing were revolutionizing how we coordinated complex travel requirements, creating proprietary systems that gave us significant advantages in serving clients whose transportation needs involved multiple aircraft and destinations. The investment in digital infrastructure was paying dividends through improved operational efficiency and enhanced client satisfaction. Most importantly, the strategic planning process was focused entirely on organic business considerations rather than external constraints imposed by family expectations or relationship dynamics. The decisions were driven by market opportunities and competitive advantages rather than someone else's insecurities about my success or concerns about appropriate gender roles. The afternoon schedule included a site visit to the new maintenance facility that would support our expanded fleet, followed by meetings with the pilot training consortium that was developing advanced certification programs for our crew members. These operational investments were positioning altitude aviation for sustained growth while ensuring that service quality remained at the premium levels our clients expected. The evening's charity gala would provide opportunities to strengthen relationships with Denver's business community while supporting causes that reflected my personal values rather than social obligations. The freedom to choose involvement based on genuine interest rather than family expectations had made civic engagement more satisfying and personally meaningful. The contrast with Marcus's current circumstances was so complete that it sometimes seemed surreal. The man who had once confidently dismissed my capabilities was now struggling with basic financial survival while I was building something that would endure long after my own retirement. His attempt to demonstrate my dependence had revealed his own inadequacy in ways that continued to reverberate throughout his diminished world. The airport terminal where he'd orchestrated my supposed humiliation had become a symbol of transformation rather than defeat. Every time I walked through Denver International Airport, whether boarding commercial flights for business travel or accessing our private hangar for charter operations, I was reminded of how completely circumstances could change when authentic capability confronted manufactured privilege. The lesson had applications far beyond personal relationships, informing business strategies and decision-making processes in ways that strengthened altitude aviation's competitive position. The experience had taught me to trust my own judgment completely while maintaining skepticism about people whose confidence wasn't supported by demonstrated competence. The Phoenix Airport incident had become a reference point for handling challenges with dignity and strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. The story was frequently requested during speaking engagements, where audiences appreciated the combination of personal resilience and professional excellence that had transformed intended humiliation into business opportunity. The documentation that Angela Foster had provided had become part of Altitude Aviation's corporate history, displayed in our headquarters as evidence of how the company had emerged from crisis stronger and more focused than before. The photographs of that day served as inspiration for employees and clients alike, demonstrating the kind of leadership that distinguished exceptional organizations from merely successful ones. Looking forward, the opportunities seemed limitless in ways they never had during my marriage to Marcus. The international expansion plans were gaining momentum with each quarterly review, while new service offerings were attracting exactly the kind of sophisticated clients who valued innovation and reliability above cost considerations. The mentorship program we'd established for young women interested in aviation careers was generating the kind of community impact that made business success personally meaningful. The scholarship fund that provided flight training for economically disadvantaged students was creating opportunities for people who might never have considered aviation careers, diversifying an industry that had traditionally excluded too many talented individuals. The speaking bureau that represented me for corporate and professional events was fielding inquiries from organizations throughout North America and Europe, evidence that the story of Altitude Aviation's growth had resonated far beyond the business aviation community. The message about turning challenges into opportunities apparently struck chords with audiences facing their own professional and personal obstacles. As I prepared to leave the office for the day's remaining appointments, I paused to appreciate the view from my corner office windows. The mountains that had always dominated Denver's western horizon looked different now, less like barriers and more like challenges to be conquered through skill and determination. The city below represented territory where my success was recognized and respected rather than grudgingly tolerated. The transformation was complete, but the momentum continued building toward even greater achievements in the months and years ahead. Marcus's attempt to diminish me had become the catalyst for discovering capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, while his failure had demonstrated the ultimate futility of trying to constrain someone whose potential was limited only by their own vision and determination. The airport terminal where this journey had begun would always hold special significance, but not as a symbol of abandonment or humiliation. Instead, it represented the moment when I'd finally understood that the only limitations that mattered were the ones I accepted for myself, and that authentic success required nothing more than the courage to pursue excellence regardless of other people's expectations or insecurities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.